I want to welcome everybody to the concluding session of our conference, the National Security State and the Kennedy Assassination. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, the sponsor of this conference. And it's been a real pleasure to host this conference. My aim from the very beginning was to provide a conference that gave the ordinary person, the educated layman, the person who's not steeped in the Kennedy assassination, a presentation as to why some of us are so convinced that this was a regime change operation. Not a theory, but an evidence-based presentation. And I believe we've accomplished that. If you agree, if you've liked what we've put together here, I hope you'll share it with your friends. All the presentations from the very beginning are on our website at fff.org. They're also on YouTube. And so this concluding session here is going to be almost entirely devoted to Q&A. We've got some of the panelists that gave presentations with us. The theme tonight is going to be the political context of the assassination. And the way it's going to work is I'm going to briefly introduce every speaker. I'm not going to do an extensive introduction like we did with their presentation, and y'all can go and check their credentials at our website, on the conference website. But I want to give you just a list of their books. That's the way I'm going to introduce each speaker. And after I introduce each speaker, we'll have the option of giving some short opening remarks. And it doesn't have to, though. He can waive those opening remarks. And then once we finish with the introductions, we'll go into Q&A. The way Q&A will work is that I'll read the question. If it's directed to a particular person, that person will answer. And then I'll ask if anybody else would like to weigh in on that question. And so once we exhaust everybody that wants to weigh in on it, we'll go to the next question, and that'll be the procedure we'll follow through to the end. So let's get started. Let me begin with Doug Horne. Doug is the author of Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, a 5-volume work. Also JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Assassinated, which is an FFF book, The Future of Freedom Foundation. And he's also the presenter on a multi-part video at the Future of Freedom Foundation's multimedia section of our website called Altered History. Doug, do you want to make any opening remarks?
Yes, I would. Thank you. Most people out there don't think I know how to do anything short, but I'm going to surprise you here. I think this will take me about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes at the most. This is what I'm going to be doing selective, very short readings from. It's a great book about the development of the H-bomb and American policy in the 1950s and the early 60s. So, like I said, I think this will only take 3 minutes. Here we go. Now here's the context. I'm going to be talking about nuclear war and the gestalt of many in government who wanted nuclear war to eliminate the Soviet Union before it could become a significant nuclear threat. They were very serious about this. And yes, this affects the Kennedy assassination quite a bit. So the context is that in 1950, Curtis LeMay had identified 1954 as the year of maximum danger, the critical year at which time we must be prepared to meet and effectively counter the full military force of the USSR. So it's NSC 68, the policy document I spoke of, that came up with that year as the year that they would have enough bombs to hurt us. And then LeMay jumped on that and endorsed it. So I continue. Both civilian and military strategists had soberly discussed preventive war in the late 1940s before the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. As the year of maximum danger approached, the question came up again for serious review within the US government. Now listen to this. In the spring of 1953, a committee headed by retired Air Force General James Doolittle, that's Jimmy Doolittle of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. A committee headed by retired Air Force General James Doolittle proposed giving the Soviet Union a 2-year deadline to come to terms and attacking it with a first strike if it failed to do so. Eisenhower promptly rejected this bizarre nuclear ultimatum. It gets worse. The question of preventive war came on to Eisenhower for review in the spring of 1954, when a Joint Chiefs of Staff Advanced Study Group briefed the president on a plan proposing that the U.S., quote, deliberately precipitate war with the USSR in the near future, before the USSR could achieve a large enough thermonuclear capability to be a real menace to the continental US, end quote. Now, one of the people who stood up against this insanity was Army Chief of Staff Matthew Ridgway, the man who had relieved MacArthur in Korea. Now he's Army Chief of Staff. And he denounced it in this way, as he reported later, quote, at the end of the briefing, the president invited comments, and I stated that this presentation left me with but one clear impression, which was that this group was advocating the deliberate precipitation of aggressive war by the US against the USSR, that I thought this was contrary to every principle upon which our nation had been founded and which it continued to profess, and that in my opinion, it would be abhorrent to the great mass of the American people, end quote. Well, good for Ridgway. And then Rhodes concludes, he says, Eisenhower concluded the debate in late 1954 by issuing an updated basic national security policy statement, quote, the United States and its allies must reject the concept of preventive war or acts intended to provoke war, end quote. Since preventive war was not an available remedy to the enlarging Soviet capacity for a first strike, SAC, Strategic Air Command, was authorized to plan for preemption, for beating the Soviet forces to the punch if intelligence indicated they were beginning a first strike. So here's the problem with what LeMay was up to in the 1950s. The Atomic Energy Commission was supposed to maintain custody on all nuclear bombs. The trouble is, they were guarded by the Air Force, and Air Force guys had the key. So, as Rhodes says here, while building the Strategic Air Command, Curtis LeMay made persistent attempts to acquire control of US nuclear weapons throughout the 1950s, independent of presidential authorization. And he began these efforts in 1950. Now, in 1957, a member of the Gaither Committee, basically the co-chair, Mr. Sprague, he and Jerome Weissner, who later became Kennedy's science advisor, they visited SAC headquarters in Omaha. And here's the exchange that took place between LeMay, the head of SAC, still the head of SAC in 57, and Mr. Sprague of the Gaither Committee. LeMay said, quote, if I see that the Russians are amassing their planes for an attack, I'm going to knock the shit out of them before they take off the ground, end quote. Sprague was shocked. But General, he countered, that's not national policy. Sprague remembered LeMay responding, I don't care, it's my policy. That's what I'm going to do. So we have some important parallels here between what happened with Eisenhower and Kennedy. Eisenhower rejects the concept of a first strike of preventive war in 1953 and in 1954. And then the name of the game with SAC becomes, okay, if we can't do that, we're going to be ready for a preemptive strike. So the name of the game for SAC in the 50s was to try to goad the Soviet Union into reactions which would justify a preemptive strike. So as the author says here, SAC flew daily intelligence missions over the Soviet Union throughout the 1950s, including deliberately provocative overflights of Soviet cities by squadrons of aircraft in broad daylight. And the hope was that they would react in such a way that they could provoke a preemptive strike by SAC. Now, I'm almost finished. What happens 8 years later, after 1954? President Kennedy gets his first briefing on the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, on July 20th, 1961. They proposed to him preventive war, the same thing that had been proposed to Eisenhower. They proposed to him a first strike on the Soviet Union 2 years later in 1963, during a period of heightened tensions. He gets mad and walks out of the meeting. So once again, a president has rejected a first strike, preventive war, and then the name of the game, once again, for SAC becomes a preemptive strike. So I conclude by reading this passage from Richard Rhodes' book. Listen carefully. During the missile crisis, the Strategic Air Command put 7,000 megatons aloft and tried to provoke a Soviet alert that would justify a US preemptive first strike. That's what was going on with Tommy Power and Curtis LeMay on October 24th, 1962, hoping the Soviets would launch some major alert and that they could launch a preemptive attack and do what Eisenhower wouldn't let them do. So I conclude with this summary statement, and this is the end. Rhodes adds a little bit more to this statement. He says, during the missile crisis, SAC put 7,000 megatons into the air, menaced the Soviet Union with an unauthorized missile launch. That was on Friday, October 26th, and deliberately flew bombers toward Soviet targets, past their turnaround points. The first and only direct nuclear confrontation between the superpowers was also very nearly the last. So my point in reading these passages is to say that the basic conflict between Jack Kennedy and the national security establishment, many people in it, is that their first option was war, and for him it was the option of last resort. Not only that, many of them actually desired nuclear war, and we should be damn glad that Jack Kennedy was president in 1962, or we wouldn't be here to have this conference. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Okay, Mike Swanson is the author of The War State, The Cold War Origins of the Military-Industrial Complex and the Power Elite, 1945 to 1963. His newest book, Why the Vietnam War. Mike, would you like to make any opening remarks?
Yeah, I want to be careful. I don't want to make it a conversation between just the speakers when we get the audience to ask questions. But it'd be so easy for me to do that though. But I'll just make two points that are kind of amplifying what Doug has just said. And the first one may sound a little contradictory. I wrote a book about Vietnam leading up to Kennedy's decision to send advisors there, and reading material, after my book has ended, I've come to a conclusion that, we look at history backwards with everything that happened and how important Vietnam became, after Kennedy died. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff sent many memos to him, especially immediately after he sent these advisors saying, this isn't going to work. We still expect you're going to have to send these troops. And then in 1963, similar sorts of memos were sent. But I've come to a conclusion that they actually didn't care that much about what was going on in Vietnam itself. And they cared about something different. And that is the strategic power and position the United States was in relative to the Soviet Union and China, and that involves nuclear weapons, as Doug Horne was speaking about. And as an example of this, Kennedy had very few meetings himself with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in particular between the Cuban Missile Crisis, between the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he had a famous meeting with them during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then about half a dozen to 10 afterwards, through January. And what's interesting about these meetings is only one was about Vietnam. The rest of them were about Cuba. And the one meeting about Vietnam, it occurred in January '63. And at this meeting, Curtis LeMay made a comment that we're wasting our time in Vietnam. The nation, you didn't use the word nation building. They're basically saying these programs aren't going to work, and we just need to bomb North Vietnam and bomb China if necessary. So I think that's the attitude they had. Vietnam was just, one place in the world. It wasn't really important what was going on in South Vietnam. It was only this big strategic picture. And I think that's probably how they saw everything. It was all about our power versus the rest of the world. And the second point I'd make is that it's my belief, and I don't know if anyone's put it this way, but I believe that what happened on November 22nd and the week afterwards, the week after Kennedy was killed, it was some sort of crisis. Kennedy's assassination created a crisis within the government, within the executive branch of the government, on how to deal with the assassination. I mean, the Warren Commission is obviously what happened, but in that sense, but also there was a direction to suddenly make Vietnam the #1 priority for Lyndon Johnson, when it wasn't that case for Kennedy. Johnson sent a memo to the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying, this is now our #1 priority, when Kennedy never would have said that. So something caused Johnson to do that. And I think it's tied up somehow with the events in November 22nd. And this is his reaction to it, unless someone's going to assume he knew about it and was part of it. And I don't. So I think it's all sort of a after the fact part of reacting to the assassination and having to direct the energy that caused it into the Vietnam War, or what became the Vietnam War.
Okay, thank you. Jim DeEugenio is the author of the JFK Assassination and Destiny Betrayed. Jim, you would like to make an opening statement?
Yeah, I'll try and make this brief. I mean, most people who follow my website, Kennedy's and King, or have seen my lectures know that for about the last 8 years, I've been working on things outside of Vietnam and Cuba. I've been trying to shed some light on other things, foreign policy-wise, that Kennedy was involved with. So I think what happened this week in Gaza is a demonstrative example of one of the changes that happened after Kennedy was killed that very, very few people talk about. All right. And in fact, at Truth Out, the Truth Out website this week, they interviewed, Darth Vader, alias Noam Chomsky. And he said that, for a long time prior to Johnson, okay, the American polity supported the Islamic fundamentalists, which is utterly false when it comes to Kennedy, because Kennedy made a deliberate break with John Foster Dulles, and he was trying to make a rapprochement with Nasser, who was the #1 secularist leader in the entire Middle East. And in fact, the Dulles brothers feared Nasser because of his pan-Arabist appeal. Nobody before or since ever had that kind of appeal. So that's, again, there's another example of a complete distortion, by the professional linguist. All right. Now, the problem with Kennedy's attempt to do this with Nasser was that the Saudis despised Nasser. I mean, the Saudis despised Nasser almost as much as Israel did, okay, because of his pan-Arabist threat. He believed that the petroleum underneath the sand belonged to all the Arabs. So if he was able to forge a pan-Arabist union, okay, it would it would really upset the whole Saudi economy, especially the royal family. So they did everything they could to thwart that idea, which they ended up successfully doing with the war in Yemen. All right. Now, the other problem that Kennedy had was with Israel and the whole Dimona reactor thing, which I think many of us know about. I don't have to go into that, very strongly. But what I believe that if Kennedy had lived, there would have been a much different picture in the Middle East. I think most of us know that Johnson completely switched back on that policy Kennedy was pursuing, especially during the 1967 war. Okay, so anyway, that's a little thing that I wanted to talk about because I think it illuminates a different aspect of Kennedy's policy, which most people ignore.
Okay. John Newman is the author of JFK in Vietnam, Where Angels Tread Lightly, Countdown to Darkness, and Into the Storm. John?
So my forthcoming volume 4, Armageddon, is going to take a deep dive, several chapters into what Doug was talking about, the widespread US sort of xenophobic state of stupor that followed the advent of the nuclear age and nuclear weapons. That sort of short-sighted zero-sum logic of the bomb throughout the Cold War was crazy, just crazy. The logic was because we have discovered these awful hydrogen bombs, we have to totally destroy Russia and China because they will inevitably have them too. Anyway, Doug's covered that very well and probably will answer those questions. This evening, I'm going to begin again with what I ended when we were last together with my operating hypothesis about the cabal behind the Kennedy assassination. But I'm prepared, if questions are put to me, to talk about some other things, and I'm not going to go into them. I'll just tell you what they are. And they're all major parts of new material in volume 4. I would like to discuss breaking new ground on, from Khrushchev's point of view, the covert and inextricably intertwined problems of the 61 Berlin and 62 Cuban Missile crises. I would be interested if somebody wants to ask for more, to offer a new and provocative interpretation that holds that the chiefs knew very early on about the coming missile deployment in Cuba, but because the chiefs wanted war with the Soviet Union and China, they purposely kept it a secret from Kennedy and his inner circle to prevent him from stopping the deployment until he was up against the wall with the missiles being prepared for use against the United States. And another area I would be willing to delve into is to offer some compelling new evidence that in May 1963, the Pentagon began secretly preparing to replace Kennedy's withdrawal from Vietnam with their own Op Plan 34A, a full-scale American intervention in Vietnam back in May. So those are the things that I'm willing to talk about, but I'm interested to hear what questions are, what everybody else has to say.
Okay, I will be both the moderator and a panelist since I was one of the presenters. I'm the author of the Kennedy Autopsy, the Kennedy Autopsy 2, Regime Change, the JFK Assassination, and the Evil of the National Security State, all of which have been published by the Future of Freedom Foundation. I want to just emphasize one point in the timeline that I did not point out during my presentation. Remember, I told you all that Johnson had expressed concern at Parkland and then on his way to Dallas Love Field after Kennedy was declared dead, of the possibility that this assassination was a first step in a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. And then he gets to Parkland, and his actions belie that concern. They actually confirmed that he was lying about that concern. Well, the timeline is very interesting. That JFK is declared dead at 1 p.m. Johnson leaves Parkland 26 minutes later at 1:26. He doesn't depart Love Field to Maryland till 2:46 p.m. That means he is there lollygagging on the ground for an hour and 45 minutes. Now, if there was any concern at all, a 1/4% chance that Johnson was concerned that this could be the first step in a nuclear strike, there is no way that he's going to be on the ground waiting for those nukes to come in. Obviously, they would have been coming into Dallas, that they would be trying to decapitate the government by eliminating both the president and the vice president. So this is a man that is lollygagging. And there's two important things to realize about this. One is that he's lying about his purported concern about being the first strike, the possibility of a first strike in a nuclear attack. Secondly, his actions are consistent with a man that is absolutely certain that this is not the first step in a Soviet nuclear attack, which is very incriminating, because how can he be that certain as to just lollygag for an hour and 45 minutes? His job, and I take issue here with Mike, I believe Johnson was up to his neck in this thing, not in the planning or the orchestrating of it. His job was to get that body out of Parkland at all costs and into the hands of the military. And that's why he was there waiting on the ground at Love Field. He was waiting for that body, and all the rest of it is a charade, the swearing in and so forth. So that's my introductory remark. Why don't we now go into Q&A? Let's see now, first one. Doug, love all your videos. What's the status of the Sidney Wilkinson, Tom Whitehead digital analysis of the Zapruder film? Weren't they going to produce a documentary? Anxiously awaiting. Doug?
Okay.
Doug, you're muted. Doug, you're muted. Doug, you're muted. Doug, we can't hear you. Doug, we can't hear you.
I've unmuted for the third time.
Okay.
Stop doing it at your end and let me unmute. Okay, great. They still intend to finish their documentary. It's many years behind schedule. Some health issues have gotten in the way with both of them, but also mostly it's a funding issue. So if somebody wants to see the Sidney Wilkinson, Tom Whitehead documentary on the Z film as much as I do, help them with funding. It's not cheap to produce a documentary. All I'll say now is, to conclude my answer, is that they've talked to, I think, 72 different people in Hollywood who think the film's been altered, and only 2 or 3 that are in denial of that. That's a pretty impressive statistic.
All right. Anybody else wish to weigh in on that? Okay, let's go to the next one. Well, he makes a long comment. Let's just go directly to the question. How did Dr. Fink get selected as one of the pathologists that night, and why? I guess, Doug, you're probably the best one to answer that one.
I wish I could remember the name. Someone had called Dr. Humes before the autopsy started and suggested to him that Dr. Fink would be available if needed. His name might have been Smith, or my memory could be wrong. It might have been somebody at the AFIP, which would make sense. That's where Fink was stationed at the time. So I think it was someone at AFIP, but I'm not real sure about the name. And then just to finish my answer, it was at 8:00 p.m. when Humes had a set of developed skull x-rays that he had already examined, that he finally called Fink at 8:00 at night and said, I've got a good set of skull films, which meant they're developed, and I've just looked at them. Would you come down and help us? So that's all I can say about that tonight.
Okay, anybody else? All right. Is there any chance that President Biden might order a release of the remaining JFK files at the National Archives in October 21? Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Well, we have a very good article about this up at Kennedy's and King by Florida attorney Mark Adamchik, who's working on this with 2 or 3 other lawyers in the Washington, New York area. I'm also preparing a proposed op-ed that I'm going to write to the Wall Street Journal okay, about this very subject. You know, since I think that what Trump did, I believe, after studying the statute, was a violation of not just the spirit, but of the letter of the law. And Mark has done a very good examination of that, and you can read his article on that. And I don't believe it's proper for Joe Biden, who has Bobby Kennedy's bust in his Oval Office and just moved John Kennedy's picture from a Boston museum into his study off the Oval Office, and was very good friends with Ted Kennedy. I don't think it's proper for him to continue this fiasco about this 15,800 other documents 58 years after Kennedy was assassinated, still to be redacted either in part or in whole. I think it's time for this to end.
Anybody else? Okay. Did Oswald actually go to Mexico City, or do we know?
You're going to have a whole debate about that, Jacob.
Don?
Anybody
Well,
want to?
I'll say one thing about that, and that is, I don't know. but an interesting thing about it, though, is there is a book. Let me see. Let me get my One Hell of a Gamble, written by Timothy Naftali and a Russian author.
Poroshenko.
Yeah, Fursenko, that had access, and he had access to KGB records and so forth. And the book makes an argument. He claims, you know, and unfortunately I don't speak Russian and I don't know anyone who's seen these documents, but anyway, this Russian author makes the claim that in the hours after the assassination, the KGB wrote a report, sent it to Khrushchev, and was convinced it was some sort of conspiracy. And what convinced them was the Oswald trip to Mexico City and some letter he supposedly sent to the Russian embassy. So whatever happened at Mexico City with Oswald made apparently the KGB's eyes go up after the assassination. Does that mean they didn't think he was there, or they thought an imposter was there, or something was not up and up on it? And I think that's the simplest conclusion we can make. At least I can, you know.
Yeah, John?
So I think that the question takes us away quite far from what really matters, that we know for a fact happened down there. Oswald, whether he was the real Oswald or an imposter, was impersonated, because the Oswald talking in the phone calls talked about a completely different perspective than what we know was going on inside the embassy, the Russian embassy and the Soviet consulate. So to go one step beyond that, why would that happen? It seems very apparent that they wanted Oswald to at least get a visa to go to Cuba. We had a lot of Cubana airline pilots take for us. And so as long as we had him on the manifest, that would mean he could have been to Cuba. And there was all these other things that have been put in place saying, hey, it was great to see Oswald in Cuba. He was walking down the street, and we 4 or 5 examples. Some letters were written to him from somebody down there talking about, it was great to see you. So the idea of the real Oswald or an imposter going down there was to make it look, to tie Oswald to the KGB and to Castro. The idea was he was going to the Soviet Union through Cuba, which was illegal as of what was put in his passport. So yeah, so he goes down there. But the point is, he fails. Whether it's him or the imposter, he does not get the visa. And he stays there 3 days and does not succeed. And so that's the point. The point is to take attention away from what the Warren, for what the Warren Commission is going to be fed, which is that Oswald did not act alone. He acted, in fact, in the employ of Castro and the KGB. But this was at the secret level. This wasn't what was being put out by the Warren Commission publicly. This was used at the top secret level. This is what the NSA was told. This is what other intelligence agencies were told. So to say that only thing I really care about is whether it's the real Oswald or an imposter who went down there doesn't get you into what the purpose of the whole thing was.
Yeah, let me weigh on that.
Deny Oswald to Castro and the KGB.
Yeah, I want to second that and reinforce it, that as part of this World War III cover story that they were having to sell, they had to establish, as I stated in my presentation last week, they had to show that this wasn't just a standalone communist who had gotten his degree in communism at some American university. They had to show that the shots fired from the front were connected to the Soviet Union and Cuba in order to create this sense of, oh my gosh, we're looking at nuclear war. And so it was really an advertising campaign of, hey, look at this guy. He's making this big hubbub. He was there, the head of assassinations at the Soviet Union. He met with him and so forth. And then if you go back to the previous question, I want to put it in the context of that too. The remaining files, you're never going to find a confession, that, you know, nothing like that. The CIA, from the very beginning, their rule was never put any assassination plans into writing. So the secret files that are still secret, they don't have that kind of smoking gun. But I'm convinced that Mexico City is part of this remaining files, because everything went wrong with that part of the operation. They showed up with a photograph of a guy that was supposed to be Oswald, and it wasn't. The CIA says, oh, well, our video equipment or our camera equipment was broken that weekend. They had an audio tape recording that then suddenly said, oh, Hoover tells Johnson, well, it turns out it's not Oswald talking, it's not his voice. Then they lose the audio tape, and then they deny it was ever existing. You've got Hardway and Lopez in the 70s with the House Select Committee getting blocked by George Joannides from getting Mexico City records. My hunch is that those secret records left there have Mexico City big time in there. And that's one of the big reasons they are so scared. And I said this several years ago, they're never going to just agree to release these records in October 21. And I believe Biden's going to do whatever they want him to do.
Let me follow up some more on that. There's two parts to this. One part that happens in Mexico, which starts as a failure, but succeeds only when they impersonate him on the phone and tie him to the Russian embassy and the Soviet, and the Cuban consulate. But there's a corresponding end to this back at CIA headquarters, where all of Oswald's records, since before he got back to the United States in '62, were removed and placed in, not in his 201 file, which is where they should have been. They were placed in a Cuban file, the FPCC file. And this included everything he had done to create his Cuban legend. And the purpose of removing all that Oswald information and hiding it, same thing had happened, by the way, during the defection in '59. All of this, the incoming stuff on Oswald was removed, not placed in his 201 and hidden in the security office for another reason at the time. Kennedy was quite alive at that time. But when this happens, and the shots ring out, Kennedy's dead, and all of a sudden, everybody goes running down the halls in the CIA because they remember working on Oswald. A whole bunch of people in 5 or 6 sections of the Central Intelligence Agency have been working on Oswald. Now, a lot of this stuff was destroyed, the official file early, but the problem they had with that is everybody who was working on it had their own copies in their desks. So we managed to get the whole file back together again. But here's the situation. When they open those triple combination safes, guess what they see? They see a really bad guy that we knew about and didn't do anything for months afterwards. And it panics the FBI and the CIA, because this is not an institutional, we haven't even got to what I think about who's behind this thing, but what happened in Mexico City was supplemented by the arrangement of Oswald's files to look like he was working for the KGB and Castro, but they had to suppress that. Otherwise, the FBI would have taken him off the parade route, because it was all in cables going from Mexico City up to headquarters. They could not let that come out until 11/22/63. And that was Angleton's job to do that. Now, there's a lot deeper. These guys knew what they were doing, and Warren fell for it. He tried not to. He said he didn't want to do that until Johnson threatened him with 40 million dead Americans. He said, I just pulled out a little story about Mexico City. And he cried. Now, Earl Warren told that same story on TV, WETA television, public television in Washington, D.C. The only change was he didn't say he cried. But he said, well, Mr. President, if you think it's that bad, I guess I'll have to take a job. And he did.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, well, John's talking about the Giesling flash warning that yeah, was it that October
flash warning?
Yeah, the October 8th, is that it comes off or something like that? Yeah,
that's what happened inside the FBI. So everybody's turning down so in the FBI, they turn off the flash warning. Everybody, anything that comes in on Oswald is supposed to go to the counterintelligence branch there, and it doesn't, right? The same thing happens at the CIA. The suppression of the Oswald files there, tone everything down. And so the guy who has to answer the cables from Mexico City has no idea that he was tied to a KGB guy down there. You know, they didn't let him see any of those things. So he didn't lie, the files lied to him. John Celso, I'm talking about. So it was across the board. Everybody had to turn off the flashing red lights for this thing to work. I called it the suppression of the virus. In 11/22/63, like a virus, it balloons up, and you know the rest of the story.
See, Danny and Eddie, who Jacob was referring, if people who don't know who those people are, that Eddie Lopez and Danny Hardaway were the two authors of the Mexico City report. All right. Now, at one of his very few talks that Danny gave, all right, I think this was in Pittsburgh, he said something I didn't know. He said they had actually written up indictments for Goodpasture, for Ann Goodpasture and Phillips for perjury, but the committee would not pass those on to the Justice Department. And there's something else I think that's important to stress here. I think we all remember Richard Sprague, the attorney, who was the first chief counsel for the House Select Committee. Didn't last very long, like about 8 months, all right, until he was forced to leave. This subject very, very much interested him, all right? And in fact, if you take a look at his first examination of Phillips, which surprisingly early in the game, he gets almost right to this subject. He wants to know, okay, exactly how did this thing work? Who actually got the tapes? Who actually transcribed the tapes? How did they get sent to headquarters if something was really important? He's really right onto this thing. He suspected that Phillips was lying about these transcripts and that he had actually dolled up the transcript. And one of the very last things he did is he flew down to Mexico City and he met the Tarasovs, who were the transcribers, and he took their typewriter and he brought it up to Washington because he was going to have it forensically examined. That's how deep Sprague was into this thing. And the reason he was so interested in this, to make a long story short, is that he did not understand why the Warren Commission didn't believe Silviodio, because he found her very credible. And there's this problem of, if it's Oswald up in Dallas at Silviodio's door, who's on this bus down to Mexico City? So this is the problem that he had as a criminal lawyer. You can't be in two places at one time. I'm always going to believe, I will always believe, that if Sprague would have stayed on as the chief counsel, history would have been different.
Okay. Let's see. Next question. This examination has at least shown a problem with the Kennedy autopsy and the assassination in general. Neither his own brother, Robert Kennedy, or his good friend, Robert McNamara, made an issue of the assassination claims that only one person, Lee Harvey Oswald, was the one responsible. They had to have doubts, and yet they did nothing. It's not a question, just an observation. Does anybody want to comment on that? Okay, next question.
I'll make a comment on it.
Okay.
And this is, I'm going to answer another, I see another question that's related to McNamara, so I'm going to try to answer both of them from
All right,
the
well,
same person.
Let me go ahead and read it then. President Kennedy was against involvement in Vietnam. His good friend Robert McNamara was a chief architect of the war. Why?
Yeah, I'm going to say something that, again, I don't know if anyone has put this forth exactly, but if you look at McNamara, you know, people, on one hand, if you look at the second question, you know, there's obviously an escalation in Vietnam when LBJ is president, and we know what happens after that. So is Robert McNamara's behavior consistent? And I think it is. If you look at it this way, from the very beginning of Kennedy's presidency, McNamara actually had one priority above all others in Kennedy that he shared with Kennedy, and that was not to have a nuclear war. And they worked on changing the PSYOP, and they started to get McNamara and Daniel Ellsberg actually got him to do it, and a couple other staffers to get involved in issues of nuclear weapons targeting and so forth. And if you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, McNamara helps push the idea of having a blockade as an alternative to invading Cuba, which is an alternative to having a big war. And I think McNamara's actions in the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, if seen in this perspective of trying to limit war, makes sense to me. So, for example, when Johnson's president, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are proposing escalations of in 1964 that could have led to war, bombing North Vietnam, bombing China, and McNamara takes actions to, yes, they escalate the war, but not to the extent that the Joint Chiefs of Staff desire. And the very last meeting McNamara has, this has come out in a book a couple years ago, Road to Disaster. The author interviews Clark Clifford, who takes McNamara's place. And there's a meeting, the very last meeting, it had been said that McNamara had some sort of nervous breakdown. And what this book reveals for the first time is that McNamara had an argument with Walter Rostow, who is Johnson's national security advisor, and other people in the room, and said that the Vietnam War was slipping out of control. The Tet Offensive had broken out. There were the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Westmoreland were edging for more forces, even asking to use tactical nuclear weapons if necessary. And McNamara was saying things are getting out of control and almost begging Clifford to make sure they don't get out of control. And I think that's the consistent thread in all, his term as Secretary of Defense. And if viewed that way, then him not wanting to investigate the people behind the assassination or just say nothing about it, I think makes sense.
I think, in my opinion, I know other people want to chime in on this. I think McNamara was fully cognizant of what happened after Kennedy's assassination. And I think that's why he commissioned the Pentagon Papers. All right. And I also think that's the reason that he kept it secret from Johnson. All right. I think McNamara was very, very disturbed by the end of 1966 about what had happened in Vietnam. And he realized, and John can talk about this, but in his debrief from the Pentagon, he said that he and Kennedy had decided in 1962 that all they could do was an advisory mission. You know, that we could not fight the war for them. And then that all changed. And I think John deserves a lot of credit for his talks with McNamara, which I think ended up provoking that book in retrospect. And in John's revised edition of JFK in Vietnam, he talks about that. All right.
Yeah, what happened there was I got so frustrated with McNamara because he wouldn't talk to me, especially about the lies that were told in 62, the May SecDef conference. And I had it all in writing, and interviewed all the people who were there. I'm going to go through this part quickly because I want to really answer the question more directly. But in the end, he did call me up and ask me to come down and talk to him, and so I did. And I was in uniform. He's still, the Secretary of Defense. I actually saluted when I went in there, and we had a fight. And I told him as diplomatically as I could that everybody else has written their memoirs about this. You're the only person, and you served under 2 presidents. We get little snippets of stuff, but somebody said this in a car. You've got to do this. And he got real mad, and I'll not go into what all was said there, but by the time it was over, we were more friendly when I left. But I was still mad that he apparently wasn't going to write a memoir. So I called up Sterling Lord because I was going to do a book called Kennedy in Cuba, and I said he's a big a producer in New York. He was my literary agent at the time, and I said, Sterling, I want to change the title of my book. He said, to what? I said, McNamara in Vietnam. He said, I don't think you ought to do that. I said, well, why? Because McNamara just called this morning. He's going to write his book. So you're right. That pushed him over the edge. We ended up working together on the book. And there were some strange things that are in there, as you know. You can read that. But I want to go back to the question of consistency on Vietnam, okay? Because I think this is a very important point. And McNamara knew he was had. He had been bushwhacked. So in May of 1963, General Taylor, who was a Trojan horse inside the Kennedy inner circle, and always had been, and I've got a whole chapter on this in volume 4. He turned down this Supreme Allied Commander in Europe position when Kennedy offered to him, and he turned down the head of the CIA because he wanted to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He had lost his control of Vietnam policy as Kennedy's advisor because he came back in late 61 when Kennedy told him not to recommend combat troops with a recommendation of combat troops acting as under a flood relief task force. Kennedy got really mad and said, all right, you're done. Now I want somebody to, who's going to be my guy on Vietnam, and McNamara put his hand up, said, it's on me. And so, but it wasn't over because there was the NSAM 111 created the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, a new command structure, and they had to have a new chief of MACV. And Taylor succeeded in putting his protege in there, Harkins. And so that's why in 62, he makes sure to take the job as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now you've got him as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and you've got his guy in there in Vietnam. Now what happens is Taylor begins working with Lieutenant General Victor Krulak, the Marine guy who was his, special operations assistant high up in the Pentagon. And he began working with Taylor and the Commander-in-Chief Pacific on Op Plan 34A, what became Op Plan 34A, massive American intervention in Vietnam, back in May of 1963. And at the same time, planning to gut Kennedy's withdrawal plan. Those two things were put into play in big time by the time the McNamara-Taylor mission got back at the end of September and early October. And so for the next 6 weeks before Kennedy's death and the issuing of NSAM 263, which was basically the order to start the withdrawal right away and everybody out in 65, what they do behind McNamara's back is to gut the real units that were going to be taken out by the end of 1963. And at the same time, behind McNamara's back to begin putting into play all that was going to be happen under Op Plan 34A. McNamara was not told about any of this stuff. Neither was Kennedy. So because of the GM assassination, there has to be a reevaluation of policy. And so they have a big meeting in Honolulu. It's scheduled for 20 November, 1963. And so finally, the Joint Chiefs tell the truth. They put it down on the table. Situation is terrible. We're not winning. We're not winning the war. And so McNamara was put on the spot. Colby was sitting right next to him at the table and it was trying to get him to push back against what Taylor was putting on the table there, which was 34A, DeSoto raids along the North Vietnamese coast to turn on their E-link capabilities so we could paint them and use that to go in. Anyway, those very DeSoto raids, as you know, ended up with the Gulf of Tonkin situation, which gave us the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and full-scale American intervention in Vietnam. So McNamara, as soon as he found out what happened, which was right after that point, he fired Harkins. That's important. If he had changed his mind or changed his stripes like a chameleon because he was now working with Johnson, he wouldn't have done that. He would have let Harkins stay right there, but he wasn't. He was pissed off. And so he began doing things. And you're right, as far as, start the Pentagon Papers, but he was doing other things, making comments that were just not in line with what Johnson wanted. And basically Johnson offered him to resign or he would be summarily fired, which is what he really was. But there were days when Jackie would come in to McNamara's office and pound on his chest, literally saying, why more deaths? He went through all that too. So I think he was loyal. That's why he was the only person Kennedy told about his secret plans to get out. He didn't tell Rusk, he didn't tell anybody else, but they figured it out. Okay, Taylor figured it out. They understood that he was lying now too. He was going to use the myth of success, judo style. Oh, we're doing good. Fine, we can come home now. That's the way they were going to. So they were not going to let him get away with it. They put the truth on the table. 48 hours before the assassination.
By the way, he didn't tell Bundy either.
That particular piece of time, from mid-62 to Kennedy's death, and what happened afterwards, I think there is a consistency. I'm agreeing with you, Jim. There's a consistency here, not an inconsistency on Vietnam.
See, he didn't tell Bundy either.
No,
there's a marvelous October 6th tape that Jamie Galbraith got declassified on the advice of his father, okay, in which McNamara and Kennedy are talking about getting out of Vietnam. And McNamara is actually describing it. And Bundy actually blurts out, what's all this about? And McNamara says, words to the effect, we're getting out of Vietnam. This gives us an opportunity to get out of Vietnam. And Bundy doesn't know what they're talking about. And there's a marvelous book by Gordon Goldstein called Lessons in Disaster, which is was going to be Bundy's, in retrospect, but Bundy passed away, but Goldstein went ahead and finished the book anyway. And as Bundy is looking through this dialogue, which he hadn't seen in decades, and Goldstein asked him, where's McNamara coming from with this stuff? And Bundy said, it's from Kennedy. Kennedy made him the stalking horse for his withdrawal plan.
Secretary of State Dean Rusk, I was on a tour going down through Georgia, where he was from. And on public television down there, you know, he wanted to debate me on this issue. And he said, oh, no, Kenny wasn't getting out of Vietnam. He never said a word about it to me. And I said, Mr. Secretary, that doesn't look too good for you, does it? And he wouldn't carry on the conversation.
And Bundy, when he looked at this, you know, he had nothing but admiration for what Kennedy had done. You know, because he said words to the effect, he'd gone around me because he knew I was too hawkish. Okay.
No, it's true enough, but he was loyal. And I know that because of the first edition of NSAM 273, which did not embrace Op Plan 34A. It said we're going to intensify the war effort using only South Vietnamese resources. That was paragraph 7. That tells me Bundy was trying to craft an NSAM that he thought his boss could approve the next day. Okay. And then, of course, Kennedy's killed, and Bundy has to take a new copy of an NSAM around to see what people are going to do with it. And paragraph 7 has 2 big slashes through it. I said, who told you to do that? And he said, Johnson told me to do that. So if he were disloyal, he probably wouldn't have done that. But it tells me that he was hawkish, but he was still loyal to his boss. He did not, and you can read that in the NSAMs, and that's in the book. But anyway, we're cruising off point. I think we got other questions. Doug Horne wants to say something. Looks like.
Okay, Doug.
Thanks. Those are great answers from you guys. As a presenter, Jacob, it looks like I cannot type in a Q&A question. I can read other people's questions. I can't type one in. So sometime tonight, since John Newman indicated a willingness to discuss it, sometime tonight, I would like to ask John Newman to discuss the possible indicators that the Joint Chiefs and others had early knowledge that the Soviets were considering putting missiles in Cuba before they had the official meetings about it in May.
All right. Well, let's set that aside in the context of what we're doing here.
We only have 40 questions left, Jacob. We'll be done by 2 in the morning.
I want to weigh in on the Bobby Kennedy aspect of this. I think it's a virtual certainty that Johnson got to Bobby by reading him in on this World War III scenario and saying, look, you have cost your brother his life. You're over there with Operation Mongoose, trying to get rid of Castro. The CIA has been trying to assassinate him, and Castro got your brother first. And now you better come on board, because we're looking at the prospects of nuclear war, because it would be the perfect way to enlist Bobby Kennedy into silence here. And notice that Kennedy's Deputy Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach, 3 days after the assassination, sends this memo out to Moyers in the Johnson White House saying, we have to convince the American people that Oswald's the only guy that did this and didn't have Confederates. And as I said in my presentation, how in the heck does he know that 3 days after the assassination? There's no way. The only way the reason he's trying to shut it down is because of this prospect of World War III. And I think it's a virtual certainty that Bobby was read in on that. Now, later, I think he probably started figuring out that Johnson had snookered him. But, you know, this is a difficult case. The autopsy fraud didn't really become manifest till the ARRB in the 90s. So there was no real evidence for Bobby Kennedy to point to there. And on the assassination itself, they did a very good job of keeping things secret there. So it would have been difficult for Bobby, no matter how convinced he was, to start saying the CIA and the Pentagon did this.
Well, you know, the Katzenbach memo was actually the second draft, because Hoover actually wrote one that is pretty much the same thing. the night before Katzenbach wrote his. Okay, so what I think is happening there is that Johnson and Hoover are kind of taking over the cover up within a couple of days after the assassination. You know, they don't want things to spin out of control. Okay, and so they're kind of making sure we have to confine this thing to this Oswald guy, or this whole Mexico City thing might blow up. Okay, that's kind of the way I look at those two memos, the Hoover memorandum and then the Katzenbach memorandum.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. Doug Horne, Robert Knutson's family all agreed that 6 months before he died in 1989, he testified before an inquiry regards to his role in the autopsy, or what he thought was the autopsy. Do we know what this inquiry was about?
Boy, that's a great question. We tried to find out just from within the government records. What was there a government body in '88 that looked into the assassination of any kind? Because he told his family it was on Capitol Hill, whatever that means. And we couldn't find a record of any body. And then his widow, since then had married someone else, but his widow, Gloria, said, well, she would try to find the letter that he had received from this body on Capitol Hill, whatever that means, telling him to come and appear. And then she couldn't find the letter. So no, we couldn't figure out what that was. And someone suggested it might have been some inquiry by William Weld. And I don't know if that's true or not. I really don't know. So no, we couldn't figure out what body it was that he spoke before. So it was very frustrating.
Okay, next question. How do we interpret Arthur Krock's article in the New York Times, October 3, 1963, suggesting that a coup in the US would come from the CIA and not the Pentagon? Anybody want to weigh in on that, or should we keep going? Okay, let's keep going.
Just briefly to say that none of that was his work. He's copying an article by David Starnes a day or two before that in another newspaper. So he's just parroting what another writer said, David Starnes, and it's that guy's opinion. And we speculate on, he quotes a high level official in the government as saying this. And everybody assumes later that maybe that's the president himself saying, if there's a coup, it's going to be the CIA, but we really don't know who the high level official was. And it's just one man's opinion. And I think if we think of the assassination in that way now, as if it was solely a CIA action, the old Mark Lane way of looking at it, I think we're hamstringing ourselves and making a mistake.
It's correct. It's Richard Starnes.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, next question. Probably directed to John Newman. What do we know about the relationship between Allen Dulles and the men who would become the Joint Chiefs, both contemporaneous to the JFK assassination and earlier in history, particularly Lemnitzer?
That's a great question. Well, if you go back in history, you're going to find Lemnitzer on board with Dulles, opposing Roosevelt, and actually working behind Roosevelt's back to on the issue of what to do about Germany after the war. And so, and that disagreement was actually even Churchill versus Roosevelt. So you find that in that instance, Allen Dulles and Lemnitzer, General Lemnitzer at that time, working for General Alexander, who was head of the entire Mediterranean theater. They'd come across Africa with Eisenhower and up the boot and so on. Anyway, the same thing happens later. You'll find Lemnitzer as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Dulles as the head of the CIA opposing President Kennedy. So it's an astute question to ask. There's a lot of stuff that happens in between on those continuums, but they're lining up usually against, certainly in Kennedy's case, the guy who was for peace.
Okay. Okay, this question comes up often. It is said that 3 weeks after JFK signed an executive order to eliminate the Federal Reserve, JFK was dead. And Lyndon Johnson, one of his first acts was to destroy the executive order eliminating the Federal Reserve. And I've seen the context being silver certificates and things like that. My answer to these kind of things is always, don't get distracted by them. That there's one irrefutable fact in the Kennedy assassination that no one can refute, and that is that the national security establishment carried out the autopsy. And that once you conclude, and I think the conclusion is inescapable, that this was a fraudulent autopsy, it leads directly to the national security establishment. There's no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. But I'll let you guys weigh in on this. Do y'all think that this is a factor in this assassination? The Federal Reserve?
That's been misrepresented. That is not what many people think it is, that he's going to take us off, the gold standard. That was a technical correction that went back several years. Okay, I've done some reading on this. Okay, so let's not take that as a reason for Kennedy's assassination. That's it, because that's not what it was really about. All right, to make a short answer of it.
Okay. Let's see. Doug, your deposition of Pierre Fink is incredible. I would rather spend a night with an alligator in a phone booth than to have to question Fink. How did you keep from laughing?
I had to bite my cheeks a couple of times on the inside of my mouth to keep from laughing. It was bizarre.
Let me first point out, just in case we got any newbies, that you were on the staff of the Assassination Records Review Board, and that you, along with the General Counsel Jeremy Gunn, were conducting this deposition of Fink. So go ahead.
Okay, well, there were only about 2 questions he answered directly. They were very important ones, thank goodness. But most of the time, all he could say is, "I can't answer that. I can't answer that." And we're thinking, what does that mean? Does that mean you're forbidden? Does that mean you're afraid? Do you suddenly have a speech impediment? What does that mean? And at one point, yes, it's true. He jumped up out of his chair and started hopping around on one leg and massaging the other leg while he's hopping around like a bird. And I guess his leg had fallen asleep or something. He could remember what he was doing in 1948 in the summertime, but he couldn't remember much about 1963, which was very strange. But at least he answered 2 important questions that made the whole exercise worthwhile. And the first one was, when was the brain exam? Was it just a couple of days after the autopsy? Was it a day or 2 or 3 days after the autopsy? And he says, no, that's too soon. It was 1 or 2 weeks later, so that was a meaningful answer. And then the other answer was about the AP skull x-ray, the front to back, anterior, posterior skull x-ray. Did you see this bright white object that you see on the x-ray now? Did you see this object on the x-ray, which looks like a bullet fragment? Did you see that on the x-ray the night of the autopsy? And he said, no. He didn't say, I don't know, or I can't remember, or I can't answer that. He said no. So in spite of all the difficulties and all the times he said, I can't answer that, it was still worthwhile. Thank you.
Yeah, well, my recollection from your book, Doug, is that you were able to use that testimony to establish, along with the fact that there were different participants at the brain exams, that there were 2 separate brain examinations.
Yes, that was a big part of it. He was quite sure that there's no way it was a few days after the autopsy. And of course, his notes to General Bloomberg confirmed that.
Yeah, and the first one, as Stringer had established, were just a couple of days after the autopsy.
2.5 days later, right?
Yeah. Okay, Doug, this is to you. How do you analyze Jim Jenkins' statement that when the body arrived into the morgue, he stayed with it until the formal autopsy started at 8 p.m.? his timeline he uses is Dennis Davis 6:35 p.m. anteroom delivery of the shipping casket. When would pre-autopsy surgery be completed and where?
Okay. Let me answer this carefully. Every one of these people that we interview who's talking about events 30 years before, 35 years before, or even longer, depends on when you interview them, they remember some things much better than others. And all of them, to some extent, have some memory merge going on. So I can only conclude that Jenkins is wrong. And it's not because he disagrees with some theory of mine. I'll give you two reasons why I conclude he's wrong about that one thing. There are two rock solid witnesses to seeing postmortem surgery on the president's skull. And one is Tom Robinson of Gawler's Funeral Home, who told both the House Select Committee staff and the review board, I saw the doctors saw the skull open to get the brain out, and they removed the brain after they sawed the skull open. And then Ed Reed, the X-ray technician, told us at his review board deposition that he saw Dr. Humes take a scalpel like this, right behind the hairline, cut the scalp open, and start to drill into it with a, not drill, but a bone saw, cutting the bone right under there. So the fact that Jim Jenkins doesn't remember anybody performing a craniotomy, doesn't remember anybody performing surgery on the skull, tells me he was not there earlier that evening. He just thinks he was, because there's a gap in his memory. So most of these witnesses are, it's like looking at a Chinese painting. They're remembering the peaks of the mountains coming up out of the fog. They're remembering the key things that were the most important to them in whatever event they're recalling, but they certainly don't remember everything. So I conclude that in that one instance, Jenkins must be wrong, because the weight of the evidence is that he was not there early that evening. He was a very good witness when it came to other things. He recalled a hole the size of a silver dollar in the back of the president's head. He recalled a wound in the right temple, just above and forward of the right ear. A very good witness, certainly in regard to trying to infuse the brain that was handed to him by Dr. Humes, but I conclude he's wrong about having been there that whole evening. He can't, his memory on that cannot be correct.
Okay, how deeply complicit was the Secret Service in the attack in Dealey and the subsequent transport of the president's body from Dallas to Bethesda? Anybody want to weigh in on that? Doug?
I'll go first, and then I know you want to weigh in, Jacob, but there was security stripping of the Dallas motorcade. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I'll list a basic. The advance agent was Winston Lawson. He was sent out there by Floyd Boring. Floyd Boring was a dirty agent. He was the #2 guy in the White House detail. He lied to Clint Hill before the trip and said the president doesn't want agents on the car anymore. That was a lie. And later, Boring admitted that, oh, the president never said that, but he lied to Clint Hill about it. Then he sends Winston Lawson to Dallas. Winston Lawson listens to the security plan by the Dallas police. This is all in the Warren Commission, 26 volumes. They propose 8 motorcycles around Kennedy's limousine. He cuts it in half from 8 to 4. And then he instructs them to keep the motorcycles behind the rear wheels of the limousine. Therefore, there's no protection to the side of or in front of the limousine from motorcycle outriders. So that's the security stripping I'm talking about. And so that's some complicity right there, certainly by some officials. So Jacob, I know you have thoughts about the removal of the body from Parkland and who accomplished that, right?
Yeah, I'll weigh in and then I'll ask if anybody else would. But I think it's also important to point out what I pointed out in my talk is that Kellerman is sitting in the passenger side of the limousine where Kennedy is assassinated. And he has a duty as a Secret Service agent to immediately cover the president with his body. And Kennedy theoretically could have survived that first shot into his throat. And Kellerman should have jumped over the seat the way Clint Hill did and covered the president, give his own life. He sat there like a bump on the log. Then he's the guy that is forcing his way out of Parkland with holding a submachine gun and having his agents brandish guns expressly designed to prevent Dr. Earl Rose from conducting an autopsy there, which he was required to do under state law. And Rose was advised of that by Rose. I've got to do this under state law. You're not touching this body. Get out of the way. And there was no doubt that they were prepared to use deadly force. And then Kellerman's in charge of the body switching, not the body switching, but the casket situation back at Bethesda. Because once they have the body brought in early at 6:35 in that shipping casket, they've got to figure out a way to put it back into the Dallas casket so that nobody's any wiser when it arrives, when it's brought in at 8 p.m., which is the official entry time that everybody sees. Well, in any operation, as you know, military operation, things go wrong. And your best officers are the ones that are able to adjust on the fly. And Kellerman was impressive. He adjusted on the fly and he was able to pull that off. I think it's also worth pointing out that when Doug was on the ARRB, the law expressly said that no federal agency was permitted to destroy records. And the ARRB sent them a letter. I think it was the ARRB sent the Secret Service, along with other federal agents, expressly a directive in writing saying, you are instructed not to destroy anything. And the Secret Service nonetheless destroyed certain important records, I think relating to an assassination attempt in Chicago, but I'm not sure about that. But they knowingly destroy these records. And finally, go ahead, Doug.
It was the archives that briefed all the federal agencies on the requirements of the act, which was henceforth, the act has been passed. You don't destroy any records unless the review board says it's okay. It doesn't even matter whether you think they're relevant or not. You don't destroy any records that have anything to do with the Kennedy administration, whether you think they're assassination records or not. And so the Secret Service, of course, destroyed about, well, a couple of months worth of files. It's in volume 5 of my book, pertaining to presidential protection and the survey trips before he would go to different cities. And one of the files they destroyed was 3 full folders of material about the Chicago trip, which was to have taken place November 2nd and was canceled. So they destroyed records in violation of the law. They had been warned by the archives not to do that. And the review board should have held a public hearing to castigate them and was considering it, but ultimately the powers that be, the board members, decided not to have a public hearing and embarrass the Secret Service. But I wish they had. It would have set a good example for the other agencies.
All right, anybody else want to weigh in on that? Okay, John, when is your new book going to be available?
Well, we're looking at the end of the year.
Okay. Next one, both of the subjects Mr. Newman mentioned are pretty explosive. So the simple question would be, what evidence does he have that the Joint Chiefs, oh, here you are, Doug, knew of the missiles in Cuba ahead of time? And to me, even more serious, what is the evidence that the military was making plans to widen the Vietnam War in May of '63? This clearly was not JFK's policy. So to me, that suggests foreknowledge of the assassination. There's 2 questions there.
Yeah, I agree that early working on 34A and getting ready to decrease, if not completely destroy the withdrawal plans that were in train, casts a lot of doubt. It looks like they know, or they could know. Let me go back to the first one. These are both the important and technical questions. So let me start with the first one. I'll set it up by reminding everybody that there was a Berlin crisis that going on most of the year 1961 and ended in late October. Just before it ended, because Khrushchev had been such a bully and was escalating, and we didn't have enough ground forces to defeat the Warsaw Pact forces, Kennedy publicly revealed the huge magnitude of the US nuclear power, way, way beyond anything that the Soviets had. And Khrushchev was humiliated and forced to back down as the nuclear-tinged Berlin crisis ended. Well, that's when the decision was made, right after that. Right away, Khrushchev made it desperate, but very secret, as Naftali said, hell of a gamble. The Soviets were outgunned and surrounded by superior American power. And Khrushchev realized that the only way to level that huge imbalance of strategic nuclear power was the deployment of medium and intermediate range Soviet missiles in Cuba. Now, popular wisdom holds that Khrushchev did not decide to deploy the missiles until May 62. This view is incorrect. My volume 4, Armageddon, will present new hard evidence about this, but I'll give you a couple of examples. First of all, Khrushchev didn't brief the Supreme Soviet or any large group on this. He initially, when he made the decision, he only let a few trusted military leaders in on his plan, which was made by the end of 61, just weeks after the end of the Berlin crisis, not May 62, to place the missiles in Cuba. Here are two facts. The National Security Agency discovered that in February 62, Khrushchev sent the head of Soviet strategic rocket forces to Cuba to begin covert construction for the deployment. Wow. Also in February 62, American intelligence observed, probably from the air, the building of a nuclear warhead storage facility at Bajikal in Western Cuba, the same one that would be used as the main warhead storage facility during the October missile crisis. Now, I could continue with a lot more about that, but that's short and quick. But let me just add a couple of points here. While NSA learned about the Soviet rocket forces chief's trip in February, at the same time, the CIA learned about the Bajikal new storage facility. And we know about that because Marshall Carter, General Marshall Carter, Army General Marshall Carter, became the deputy director of Central Intelligence in April 1962. He had access to this top secret CIA information. Lemnitzer also knew about it because Carter was his longtime protege. So while US intelligence was in possession of this highly sensitive information in February 62, JFK was not told about it until mid-October. On 10 August, Director of Central Intelligence McCone predicted that MRBM and IRBM missile might be deployed, but he did so only on the basis of Cuban reports of the presence of surface-to-air missiles. Now, General Carter had a habit of not sharing important data with his boss, DCI McCone, who along with JFK was unaware of this crucial news from February until the MRBM and IRBM missiles were in the final stages of preparation for use against the United States. The chiefs wanted war. Oops. That's the end of that. My response. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? New information.
It's tremendously exciting, and I can't wait to read more about it.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? All right. Jacob, can you reiterate why LBJ was removed from the 68 ticket and how it was related to Dallas? Yeah, this is covered in my book, The Kennedy Autopsy 2. Johnson, in my opinion, had every intention to run for re-election in 68. Johnson wanted to be president practically his entire life. He enjoyed being president. He loved the adulation. He loved the power, and he hated the Kennedys. And the notion that Johnson would run scared because Bobby Kennedy entered the race or because Eugene McCarthy came close to beating him in New Hampshire, I think is nonsense. Johnson had taken on one of the most popular governors in Texas history, Coke Stevenson. Johnson was not a man to be afraid of running in a race. I think there's a much better explanation for this. You see, once Bobby Kennedy enters the race, it's a virtual certainty that the assassination is going to be a campaign issue. And in the heat of a campaign, there's no telling what's going to happen. Now, we can look back in retrospect and see all these anomalies and fraud in the autopsy. But keep in mind, that's 30 years after the assassination. And they put a cap on it. They made everybody sign oaths of secrecy, or most everybody. They were threatened with criminal prosecution if they ever talked. And it worked. I mean, for 30 years, by and large, it worked. Then the ARRB discovers Sandra Spencer and Roger Bojajan and other people and other evidence establishing the early entry of the body into the morgue. Well, imagine if it's a campaign issue. I mean, all bets are off now about keeping it secret. You don't know what's going to be leaked to the New York Times by one of those people that carried the body into the shipping casket. Or maybe Sandra Spencer decides to secretly leak to Dorothy Kilgallen, who was challenging the official version of the events. And so I think the much more logical thing is that the powers that be that orchestrated this thing walked into Johnson's office and said, "You've had a good run, but we can't afford to have you be the candidate." Because once he's removed as a candidate, the assassination goes out the window as far as an issue. And that's exactly what happened. Johnson drops out and nobody brings up the assassination anymore. And I think that's a much more logical reason as to why Johnson dropped out. Also, after New Hampshire, remember in New Hampshire, Johnson was depending on write-in votes. He wasn't on the ballot, and he still beat McCarthy. And then after that, he told aides, we got a fight on our hands, and he sent them to Wisconsin, which indicates that he was getting ready to fight. And I think they shut him down. Anybody else want to weigh on that?
Dorothy Kilgallen died in 1965.
Oh, okay. Well, then she could have leaked to anybody. In other words, all bets are off. Okay.
There was also, the wise men told him that he couldn't win the war.
Oh, that's yeah. Of course, there were all the massive war protesters. No doubt about that too.
I'm talking about all the people that had advised his, 4 presidents told him that it was finished. There's nothing he could do. It was a draw or lose.
Okay. Now, I think this has been already explained, I think by you, John, but does anyone else remember a woman in the Southwest, I think they're relating to Sylvia Odio, who claimed that a man named Lee Oswald and 2 other men came to her home while trying to convince her to donate to their political cause, while another Oswald was in Mexico City?
Yeah, that's the famous Sylvia Odio incident.
Sylvia Odio, that's what that is.
Okay. Bobby authorized 3 private investigations, but he had to stand behind the official position. Otherwise, it would have been leaked that Bobby Kennedy was behind the use of the mafia and the Castro assassination attempts, which would have ruined his political career. He had to bide his time until he became president. That's just an observation.
Bobby was not behind the CIA mafia plots that killed Kennedy. Okay. And by the way, Jacob, I have to tell you, the second time this has happened at a conference that you held. Okay. He was, the CIA IG report is very, very clear about this. Okay. And in fact, at the end, the writers of the report say to Helms, can we claim presidential approval for this? And they answer the question as saying, no, in this instance, we cannot claim presidential approval for this. And that's why they had to send 2 CIA briefers in to tell Bobby Kennedy, this is what's happening with this thing with Mayhew in Las Vegas, because he didn't know anything. He didn't know anything about it.
Well, what do you mean this is the second time? I don't know of any.
Because at your conference that you had in Virginia, which was a live-in conference, it was a live conference. You remember that?
Yeah.
Oliver Stone spoke at.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, 2 speakers at that conference said this same thing. One was Kinzer. One was his Senate investigator. Okay. I don't know. I can't remember his name right now. Okay. They said this same thing. Okay. And so then when I got up to speak, that was the first thing I wanted to address. Okay. That the declassified record does not hold this out.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with you, and I don't think anybody.
Oh, good. I'm glad you agree with me. Great.
No, okay. I mean, Bobby
I want to
Kennedy,
weigh in on
Bobby Kennedy was prosecuting the mafia. The thought that he would have the CIA enter into a partnership with the mafia while he's prosecuting them is ludicrous. But I don't know of anybody at this conference that has made that claim.
No. I mean, what I was talking about was the other conference.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, look, let's since we're on this, Bobby, got his brother killed and almost started World War III. The person, now, first of all, there was stuff in the files. We talked about this earlier that made it kind of look like that in the beginning. But the guy who really ran this thing to death for 30 years, Sam Halpern. I spent 4 chapters, count them, not 1, not 2, 4 chapters, tearing him to smithereens. Okay, he made it all up and didn't know what he was talking about. I'm not going to go into the details. It was crazy, pure crazy stuff. And now what happened was, along comes the church committee. And I know he read it because in all of his interviews, I made a notation of every time he said, I read the church committee report. He found out, but it was too late. He is so invested in it, he could not stop doing this. But he found out when he read the church committee report that it wasn't Bobby. It was his own boss, William Harvey, who had hired the mob to kill Castro. And so, but he continued to do it. And so it's a complete malarkey. And now we have all these, onesies, these guys that have a TV show here, or, Sabato down at UVA who's written his one book. Everybody writes one book on the case, and they're all still singing this song. Bobby Kennedy, he got his brother killed by trying, because he was fooling around trying to kill Castro, using the mob to do it. It's bull crap.
And for those who don't know, that's in John's volume 3, Into the Storm, those chapters.
All right. Anybody else? Okay. Has there ever been an analysis of exactly what the outcome would have been of a full nuclear exchange in 1962 with the ordnance available to the combatants at that time? Would it have truly been an on-the-beach scenario? Would mankind have been destroyed? Go ahead, Doug.
The short answer is yes. First of all, until 1960, I was just reading this today, the Soviet Union had no way of putting a nuclear bomb on the United States until 1960. And from 1960 to 62, very few. None of their 100 or 140 or whatever you want to count bombers would have made it. All their bombers, first of all, so we would have destroyed the world without their help, okay? None of their bombers would have made it over the North Pole because they had to land in the Arctic, take off from the interior of Russia, land in the Arctic to refuel, and then come over the North Pole. And we would have nuked their refueling bases. And we had like 42 interceptor squadrons ready to shoot them down over Canada if 3 or 4 bombers got through on a one-way trip to hell, Now, they started to have a few ICBMs in 1960. I think they had 4, would have taken them, 24 hours to get them ready to launch. Absurd. By 1962, I'm doing this from memory, they had, I think, 6 obsolescent R7s and 16 of the new R16s, but they weren't very reliable yet. So they might have landed a few bombs on us, but not many in 62. They would have destroyed Europe with their IRBMs and MRBMs, so they wouldn't have destroyed us. But we would have destroyed the world because, first of all, 2 points I want to make. The death statistics put out by the Air Force planners only accounted for, the PSYOP planners, only accounted for blast effects. They didn't account for heat or fire or radiation. They only accounted for blast. And Admiral Felt himself, SINCPAC, criticized that in 1961. He said, hey, they're only talking about deaths due to blast. He said, what about radiation and heat? And then we have all the nuclear winter studies in the 1980s. And then probably the best book ever written about nuclear winter was in 1990 by Carl Sagan and Richard, I think it's Richard Turco. Basically, with the United States destroying all of the Soviet Union and China and Eastern Europe, with various scenarios of how much we destroyed them, but it was going to be a lot of megatonnage. All of the resulting fires due to heat effects of the fireballs of the.
And they had 2 or 3 bombs for each target.
Yeah, thank you. 3 bombs for each target, massive overkill, and the resulting pall of smoke, just never mind the radiation for a minute and the mutations afterwards and the radiation sickness. The pall of smoke from these global fires over half the planet and Europe would have lowered the temperature of the Earth, even in the summertime, to below freezing in the Northern Hemisphere for at least a year, possibly up to 2 or 3 years, depending on how serious the nuclear exchange was. So agriculture would have failed and civilization would have failed. And there may have been some human survivors 3 years later when the sun came out again. But as Khrushchev said, the survivors would have envied the dead.
Well, Doug, don't you think that even though Khrushchev could not reach the US, that he would have fired a bunch of his missiles in Europe?
Yes, yes, he would have. They would, if there had been a full nuclear exchange, general war, yes, I believe they would have executed their war plan too. And so Europe would have been toast.
Okay, anybody else? All right, Dr. Newman, in JFK in Vietnam, one of the sub-themes you developed, which is rarely mentioned in the JFK assassination literature, was the military back channel to Vice President Johnson. You named the individual, I believe, who gave him the real numbers regarding what was happening on the ground. I guess he's relating to Vietnam, unlike the phony reports which were given to President Kennedy. Please discuss this matter and its possible significance regarding Dallas and beyond. Thank you to all the other participants for the important work you've done over the years concerning the important national event.
So I want to preface my answer to that question by saying when I first wrote JFK in Vietnam, I was only aware of this phenomenon happening on the Vietnam statistics coming from MACV back to the Pentagon in Washington. When I went down to spend a long time in the LBJ library with Heather Fear, one of my research associates, we were there for 3 days. We found out that the same thing happened on just about every issue. In other words, Howard Burris was the guy who was doing this. He was getting this information through the back channels from military intelligence people. And I interviewed him many, many times, but he was writing memos to the vice president, having all the exact correct figures for Viet Cong forces, how many there were, and what was going on the battlefield, which was terrible. And so, but false information was being fed to McNamara by MacV and from McNamara to President Kennedy. So you have a situation where it's very seditious. And Johnson never mentioned it, by the way. Johnson got the, in any of his books or any of his interviews, but it's all there in the documentary record. I was able to get it released by the Center for Military History shortly before I published JFK in Vietnam. So that was even in the first edition. This happened in the spring of '62 and continued until literally the 20th of November, 1963, when they put the truth on the table. I call it the optimistic interlude. We're winning, we're really kicking their butts, and we weren't. It was the other way around. So it's an amazing thing to think you can do this and get away with it, but they did. Now, in all fairness to McNamara and Kennedy, they were a little busy with Cuba in 1962. And it took them a while to figure it out. And they did figure it out. McNamara asked me when he figured it out. And I said, well, I can't tell you for sure, but I can tell you when you had the opportunity to figure it out. He was sending, Kennedy was sending Mansfield over and the CIA weighed in, and the CIA said, oh man, these figures are crap. There were just so many indicators. By the end of '62, the Kennedy brothers knew it. And they shared it with some friends, but not with anybody in the power structure except for McNamara. You know, So that's when Kennedy decided that they were going to secretly have to pull everybody out in 65. But it was the Buddhist crisis in the spring of 1963 where the political bottom fell out. They realized they had to accelerate the withdrawal plan. And so that is, at that point, as I was briefing earlier, if you recall, just a little while ago, half hour ago, was when General Taylor, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and his folks in the Pentagon decided that they're going to start finding ways to cut down and destroy the withdrawal plan, and at the same time get ready for Plan 34A. So it's hard for me to imagine any way they think they're going to get away with this while with Kennedy in the White House. They can't. So it's clear cut that when they're doing this stuff, and of course they're doing it secretly. Both sides are secretly trying to fool the other side, and neither side's fooled here. So it's a game of chicken. But so I think that it was sometime after the missile crisis in '62, which the chiefs thought was a failure because we didn't have a war and take out Russia and China, which it isn't, of course. He saved the planet and paid with his life for it. But sometime in that time frame, in the fall of '62, that we turned the corner. We don't have the actual opportunity yet, but the motive and the means. The motive started in the Bay of Pigs, and the means were clearly there in '62. Why? Because the Kennedy brothers went and did it again. They were going to try and overthrow Castro without going in with troops, and there was no reason to think that anything had changed. In fact, it was much worse in ß62 than it was in '61. There were far more tanks and artillery pieces and counter suppression of free will going on in Cuba. All the exile forces had been either in jail or were going to be jailed or were leaving Cuba. And so there was no reason at all for the Kennedy brothers to do it. And they did. They went back in again, I think, because they were embarrassed or hurt. And Mongoose, as Sutter said, was Bobby's worst follow. And he, so there's no doubt. But you can't conceive of, like, Lansdale's another interesting guy, right? He's the one who, during Mongoose, did exactly what he's told not to do, which was to recommend, American forces going in there. And what he did was but he was the officer in charge for Mongoose. And he was to put all these tasks for how we were going to, topple the regime by not sending in U.S. forces. And what he did, instead of doing what he was told, was to front load all of his recommendations with the Northwoods plan from Lemnitzer. By the end of the first month of the year, by the 28th of January, just about everything Lemnitzer wanted to put on the table was already put in there. He was a stalking horse for Lemnitzer's Northwoods plan. And you know what that is? That's a false flag operation. We're going to kill some people trying to escape from Cuba. We're going to shoot some people in Miami and in Washington. We're going to sink a ship and make it look like all this was done by the Cubans so that the American people will go to war. We're going to use lies to convince the American people to go to war against Cuba. That's what it was. And eventually, of course, the Kennedys kneecapped Lansdale and confronted Lemnitzer personally, and Kennedy rebuked him. But you can't imagine Lansdale doing all of this stuff. His dream was to become the DM's, personal. Anyway, his top advisor over there, and Kennedy wouldn't let him go, and he knew he would never ever get what he really wanted while Kennedy was in the White House. He's just another person that can't wait to jump on board with these guys. And Lansdale was never a huge across the plains of Normandy guy. That guy was a counterinsurgency guy, but he realized that that the star rising on the horizon was the Vietnam War. He planned on being there. He did everything he could to help out Lenmich and those guys. So what happened in terms of all the deception went sideways when the Kennedys found out about it. They kept it quiet, but the decision was already made to kill John Kennedy. I'm talking about it until after he's dead. And then, of course, the Vietnam situation it plays directly into the assassination of both the King and Bobby. But I think it's a straight road from the fall of '62. It's in the works, death of the president. That's why people are doing things they wouldn't otherwise do.
Anybody else? Okay, this question is directed to me. Jacob, I'm still fascinated by your statement last week to the effect that any grassy knoll conspirators, if caught, would have been tied to a communist conspiracy, in quotation marks, as part of the design of the actual plot. This raises fascinating implications that I've never considered before. For instance, in effect, you would have 2 or 3 potential patsies rather than just Lee Harvey Oswald. And I just wonder if you could more fully elaborate on this statement. Thanks again for the wonderful conference. Well, let me clarify this because the question there assumes things that I'm really not contending. This is the most sophisticated part of the plot, and it's the most ingenious part of the plot. But you have to take really a lot of care to break it down and understand exactly what was happening. Remember, the brilliant part of the plot was blame a communist, as I said last week. The ingenious part of the plot was figure out a way to shut down the investigation because it's gonna lead to the national security establishment. They can't afford to have an investigation. So they have shots fired from the front, but those are not going to be patsies. Those are government agents, contractors, assassins that the national security establishment has contracted with, or maybe they're just agents of the military or the CIA. Doesn't matter. The only patsy you have in this scenario is in the rear. That's Lee Harvey Oswald. He's the guy they're framing, the intelligence agent they're framing. So what the plan is they're operating on 2 levels. One is the federal level where they're trying to get this thing shut down. That's where they implicate the people in the front. They're saying, Johnson's there saying, look, this is clearly a Soviet-Cuba operation. Oswald had gone and tried to defect to the Soviet Union. Now, 30 days before the assassination, he makes contact with both embassies in Mexico City. Clearly, the guys that have fired from the front are part of this Soviet-Cuba Oswald conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy. So if we're going to avoid World War III, if the American people find this out, they're going to pressure us immediately to retaliate. We're looking at World War III. Now, if they had caught the guys firing from the front, that would have been the end of it. There's no way that those guys could have outlasted and said, we're communist agents of the Soviet Union. I mean, that would have broken down very, very quickly, and it would have led to the national security establishment. So that part of the plan, they had to make sure was foolproof, that whether it was 1 shooter or 2 shooters from the front, I guarantee you they had that perfect, that guy or those guys were going to get away. And because they couldn't afford to have them captured. If they were captured, the whole thing would have been over. So they got away, and then you operate on that federal level that gets people like Katzenbach to say, we got to shut this thing down. We're looking at World War III. And then on the public level, oh, look, folks, nothing to see here. Only 1 guy in the rear. He's already dead. No other Confederates. Let's move on. Nothing to see. So that's how the thing was playing out. Anybody else want to weigh in?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
And if they had been captured, they would have been speaking French or Italian or Belgian, and that wouldn't have been good either. They wouldn't have been patsies. They would have been identified as probably recruited from Gladio units. That's all I want to say.
Okay. Did Bobby? Okay, that's already been answered. Uh-oh. My dog is barking. It's not a good sign. I've heard a lot of hype about how Bobby was going to reinvestigate his brothers. Haven't seen real proof of this. Hearsay and theorizing seem to be keeping this going. I just don't forgive Bobby for supporting the Warren Commission publicly. I don't think he would have destroyed the brain had he intended to investigate publicly. Any real proof about his intentions had he been elected president?
Well,
Anybody
if
want to
you-
weigh on that?
yeah, I mean, if you haven't read Lisa Peace's book, okay, will you feed your dog, Jacob?
Well, Cassie, come down here. Come here, girl. Come here. Well, that's not the problem. The problem is she might have to go to the bathroom.
Is Bart going to take over?
He might.
Okay. If you read Lisa Peace's book, and by the way, I have to recommend everybody, if you haven't read that book, you really should, because in my opinion, it's a quantum leap beyond all the other RFK books. Okay. And she has several sources in there that is what Bobby Kennedy was planning to do, if he was elected. And she makes a very good case that that's the reason he was assassinated, that after he won California, it really looked like he was going to win the nomination. All right. And that was the reason for his assassination. Now, the only thing she has in there more than the reasons for the assassination is the whole setup for thing. And I don't see how anybody could possibly think that was not a conspiracy after reading the information in that book. And in my opinion, I'm really glad we have all these conferences and everything. But the RFK case is something that really doesn't get, I believe, talked about as much as it merits. Because if you think about it historically speaking, which is what I do, okay, that it was that assassination that really ended the 60s prematurely. After
It also ended any chance of stopping the Vietnam War.
right. John
It's a
teaches
really big deal because
John-
they knew
John-
that he was going to win that primary, and they knew if he won that primary, he was going to be elected.
Mhm. And John, are you still a professor?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, see, John teaches a class in the 60s. Okay, so if you take a look at those assassinations, it was really Bobby Kennedy who was the last great hope, of what that decade really stood for. And once they got rid of him, in 1968, that was it. That was it for the it was the end of that decade.
Can I just add something to that? It was a twofer. They killed King first, just weeks before they killed RFK.
Yes.
And
Right.
he was actually going to run for president until he found out Bobby was going to do it. So then he stood back and said, okay.
Mhm.
He got rid of King first and then Bobby. And that was the end. Those two guys there were standing in the way of who, my army.
All right. Question for Dr. Newman regarding the succession of General Maxwell Taylor replacing Lyman Lemnitzer on October 1, 1962. What, if anything, changed when Taylor replaced Lemnitzer?
Okay, well, I scooted around this once earlier. So he wanted that job. And one of the problems that Kennedy had was General Norstad, who was the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, he had to be replaced. Kennedy and he weren't getting along too well. So he offered that post to General Taylor. And General Taylor said, nah, my wife and I have been overseas too much. I don't want that job. So a week or so later, he says, well, how about the head of the CIA? Why don't you do that? No, I don't much want to do that either. And so that's, so what he wants to do is to get the job that he did, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And it puts him in a position to get real control now of Vietnam. He's got his guy in there. So that's one of this is a lot of musical chairs going along here, right? You've got the SACEUR position, you've got the CIA position, you've got, and you're chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So it's a terrible mistake, by the way, for Kennedy to, once he can't put Taylor in that position, to give it to Lemnitzer. What he should have done to Lemnitzer is say, first of all, let me put this on the table. Lemnitzer's job as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was up anyway that summer. And his ability to stay in the Army was ending in the spring of 1963. So what Kennedy should have done is just say, I give you some medals, but you're going to take that uniform off. You're done, guy. Nice job. He didn't do that. He was scared. They were scared of a coup. And so it totally blew Lemnitzer's mind and blew everybody else's mind. He offers them to be the head of the SACEUR position is the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. And why that's such a bad deal? It's a bad deal to put Taylor in there because Taylor is gonna turn on Kennedy's Vietnam policy. But when you take Lemnitzer and stick him over there in the SACEUR position, you're giving him the keys to the kingdom, to NATO. And under NATO are the two clandestine committees that Lemnitzer had a role in setting up way back in the day. And these are what turned into Gladio units. Originally, they weren't supposed to be Gladio units that were going to interfere in all the elections of every country in Europe, which they did. Originally, the idea was that, oh, here the big Russians are going to come, or they're going to go march all the way across Europe to the Atlantic, and we're going to have these stay-behind units that are insurgency warfare for self-defense. Well, what happens is the insurgency for self-defense is turned into Anglo-American hegemony over the world. And in that regard, the MI6, the British CIA, and our CIA are the ones who worked with these super secret committees under NATO to do just that, beginning at the end of the 40s and all the way up to 1990 till they were outed. But it's been the most secret thing ever in our history of our intelligence is what we did to all those countries. And that's why it remains a secret, because if that becomes very conversant over there, people aren't going to like us very much. We would have people killed, blow stuff up and blame it on the communists and socialists. They were all false flag operations. And why are we so sure? And I've got a chapter it's working on a good bit of this. There's a lot of new work on this particular Gladio history. But what happened was, in the end, many of the people who participated, especially for the CIA, came forward on camera, told their stories, everything they did, and all the people in all those other countries. And they were filmed by Frankovich. All three series of Frankovich films interviewing all these people that did all these things, including the CIA guys that came clean, even high-level ones. And when he got off the plane, when he got back from Europe, he died.
All right.
I need to weigh in here.
Okay.
Just for a second. It pertains to that specific question. I'm going to hit screen share and show you two pictures of the date that the question was asking about. This is October 1st, 1962. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
That's
Lemnitzer.
That's Lemnitzer. Kennedy's putting a medal on him, and Lemnitzer looks very unhappy, to say the least, that JFK, his nemesis, is putting a medal on his lapel. He does not look happy at all. And now look at the following picture from the same ceremony on October 1st, 62. Can you see that? The black and white one?
No.
No.
No?
No.
You can't?
No.
No.
That's too bad. I took the other one down.
It looks like it's frozen or something, the screen.
Okay, let me try something. Let me try screen share. I know this will work. Stand by. How about that?
Yeah.
Okay. Look at, this is after the medal. Lemnitzer, in my opinion, has absolute hatred on his face. Kennedy doesn't look too pleased with him either, but he's a little bit more restrained about it. Look at who's behind Lemnitzer. The cat that swallowed the canary. Look at Max Taylor's face. He's got exactly what he wanted.
Yep.
The Trojan horse, there he is. He's got exactly what he wanted. And not only that, an ally of his, Lem, is going over to Europe. So that's just, that's what I wanted to do, was share that with everybody that pertains to the question. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay,
Well, okay, this is a kind of a sidelight. When Gerald Ford appointed the Rockefeller Commission, all right, he had Lemnitzer on it, okay, along with people like Ronald Reagan. And at a very private buffet lunch at the White House, an editor for the New York Times, okay, asked him, why did you appoint all these obviously conservative people to this panel? You know, it was a time of tumult, you know, everything's finding out about all these secret operations. And Ford said words to the effect, because we have to keep some of these things secret. And the guy said, like what? And he blurted out, like assassinations. Okay.
Who said that?
Okay.
Ford?
Ford said that, right?
What a
It's in Daniel Shore's book, Clearing the Air, because he was there. All right.
all right. Next question. What should a pro-peace, non-interventionist U.S. president do in order to neutralize the hawks in the national security state? Unfortunately, the military and intelligence community will do everything in their power to undermine a non-interventionist president.
Nixon had the answer to that. Give him marijuana, let him smoke.
Well, it's what I keep maintaining in this is that this is not just a historical matter that we're looking at. Like all the people involved in this are dead. That we're looking at an institutional problem here. That these regime change operations are structural. That what happened here was no different in principle from what happened in Chile with Pinochet and Allende. That really what the ultimate solution is the restoration of a limited government republic and the dismantling, not the reform, notice I don't say reform, of the national security establishment. In other words, an abolition of the CIA, an abolition of the NSA, dismantling of the Pentagon, the massive military industrial complex. In other words, what the founding principles of America were. And you know, one of the shocking things that shocked me when I first was getting into this is that a major figure in this so-called research community, I said, you know, we really need to get rid of the CIA as part of this. And he was shocked. Oh no, Jacob, you know, they may have assassinated Kennedy, but we need them for national security. And I was just stunned. The ultimate solution here, and the reason that I keep harping on this is that structurally, we've got a major problem in this country, and that is that America is a national security state. And that's what Kennedy was threatening. It wasn't just ending the Cold War that he was talking about, even though he never said we need to restore a limited government republic. That was the natural implication of what he was doing. Since the Cold War was the justification for having converted the federal government to a national security state, the natural implication, especially back in '63, when people still had memories of a limited government republic, the natural implications, which the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA had to realize was no Cold War. We don't need you guys anymore. Anybody else? Okay. Now this one's about Tippit. Jim, Don Thomas, and Brownlow and Pulte suggest Harry Olson assisted Tippit at 10th and Patton to complete the Dallas Police Department capture of Oswald as part of the setup. You can't set up Oswald in the school book depository and not capture him, kill him, and shut the case down. Is it possible Oswald realized he was set up when Tippit just happened to pull up alongside him and Oswald got in first and shot Tippit? I imagine that's addressed to you too. That is to you, Jim. I'm sorry.
I like Don, and I think his book is a valuable book to read. I disagree with him about the Tippit case. All right. And I've actually written about this at length. I wrote about a 17-page essay on this. I don't think Oswald shot Tippit. Okay, for a lot of different reasons, but I disagree with him on that. He thinks that Oswald did shoot Tippit. I don't agree with that. Harry Olson is a hell of an interesting character who, you know, as we know, the Warren Commission did not do a very good job on him. All right. Him and his girlfriend, who I believe was Kay Kendall at the time. Okay. Were never, ever really cross-examined and explored the way that they should have been, because they had some interesting connections to Jack Ruby. All right. But I also believe that if you take a look, you know, we tend to forget that Bert Griffin actually did try and cross-examine Patrick Dean. Okay. And we also tend to forget that he more or less accused him of being a liar. All right. And now what happened in that was that Dean then complained to Wade and Fritz. And that caused Wade and Fritz to actually go ahead and read Warren the Riot Act. All right. And so therefore that really curtailed the whole investigation, because one of the people I believe who was central as part of the Dallas police cover-up was Patrick Dean. All right. I believe that Dean, if you read the House Select Committee report, I believe it was Dean who arranged to have Ruby come in that side door. Ruby did not come down the ramp. I mean, the House Select Committee makes a very good case for that. All right. I think it was Patrick Dean who actually let Ruby in through that side door across the street where he was at the Western Union. And if you look at this, I don't know how many people are familiar with this very good documentary, Evidence of Revision. I hope people know what I'm talking about. It's a wonderful documentary, and it has the clearest film I've ever seen of Ruby literally hiding behind Blackie Harrison when he's waiting for Oswald to come out. All right. And then as that happens, two horns go off. One horn goes off when Oswald comes out to the foyer, and one horn goes off right before Ruby leaps forward to actually kill Oswald. So I in my opinion, I disagree with Don on that actual point. All right, that Oswald did shoot Tippit.
Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, just briefly. And Joseph McBride has written a great book, Into the Nightmare, and he's a Tippit expert. And I recommend that to everybody if they haven't read it yet. Into the Nightmare by Joseph McBride.
Okay, this is an interesting question. Who, if anyone in the mainstream media, distinguished themselves by reporting with a skeptical eye on the official story during the aftermath of the assassination?
Martin Stedman, a guy who probably nobody has ever heard. Martin Stedman was in Dallas, and he stayed there for about 10 days afterwards. And he wrote a report, which is, you can actually see it online now. I don't think it was published at the time, where he interviewed Malcolm Perry. Okay. This was about 4 days after the assassination. And he actually got Perry to say that there was no doubt in my mind that the anterior neck wound was one of entrance. He said, I've done literally hundreds, okay, of these kinds of operations. And so I know what I was looking at. And also I'm a hunter. Okay, so I know what an entrance wound looks like as opposed to an exit wound. This one did not have ragged edges. All right. And he then said that night, I started to get phone call after phone call from Bethesda. And he specifically said it was the pathologists. They were talking to me. All right. And they said I didn't know what I was talking about. Okay. All right. And this is what was new in Martin Stedman's report. He said, when I wouldn't go along with them, they threatened to bring me to court and to bust my medical license. All right. Which I never heard that before. Now, there's something else that goes along with that. There's this film called The Parkland Doctors, which was shown at the Houston mock trial, but it wasn't on the broadcast. You had to actually be there in the room. All right. And in that film, I think it was McClelland, towards the end of the film, they're describing the famous Kemp Clark, Malcolm Perry press conference where Clark and Perry essentially let the story out of the bag. Clark says that there was this large wound in the occipital area, and Perry said that it was an entrance wound in the neck. McClelland said, right after the press conference, and remember, this is like 90 minutes after the assassination, some guy came up to Perry with a suit, white shirt, tie. To him, it looked like an FBI agent. And he grabbed Perry by the arm. And he said, don't ever say that again. All right. So I was with Bob Tannenbaum when I was watching this. And I go, Bob, did you just hear that? And he said, Jim, they knew in 90 minutes that they had to snap on a cover story. All right.
Okay. Doug, did you want to add anything?
Oh, I never heard that before. That's great. It corroborates what Audrey Bell told us. She was operating room nurse who was in trauma room 1 for 5 minutes. And she said when she saw Dr. Perry again on Saturday, November 23rd, she said, you look like hell. Well, what's wrong? And he says, well, I was up all night. They wouldn't stop calling me from Bethesda, trying to get me to change my mind about the throat wound being one of entrance. So this is corroboration for that he also told someone else. So I think it's very valuable historically. And thanks for sharing that, Jim.
You're welcome. By the way, another guy is this Jackman guy from the Washington Post who did a 4-part series on the RFK case. So he's like, right now, he's probably the best journalist we have out there. I mean, there's also Jefferson Morley, of course. Okay, but he's kind of a freelancer.
All right. Well, I think it's worth mentioning the woman that we talked about earlier in a different context, and that's Dorothy Kilgallen. She was writing op-eds that were questioning and ridiculing the official version. And the 2 books that have been written on her book, I thoroughly enjoyed. I don't know how y'all feel about them, but I thought they were very well done. I forget what their names are of the books. Okay, here's the next one. If the Joint Chiefs were so fired up for war, why was their reaction to the JFK assassination so subdued? I understand that they were not surprised by the event, knowing it was not a KGB or Cuban act, but why did they take such mild actions at the time, like not going to a higher DEFCON, not activating relocation to offsite command centers, and according to John Judge, instructions to SAC bombers to maintain strict radio silence on November 22nd? Instead, shouldn't they have immediately used the assassination as an excuse to go to war? Thanks for the great comments tonight. Now, let me add to that a question that I got by email today that asked me to address it tonight. One thing keeps bugging me is very clear that the plan involved framing a communist who had ties to Cuba and the Soviet Union. That would be very consistent with an Operation Northwoods action, which would lay the blame on Cuba and or the USSR for an attack on the US, thereby justifying immediate pretext to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. Once the DRE and CIA immediately publicized Oswald's background, one would think, based on Northwoods, that the Joint Chiefs would have had the excuse they needed and had bombers in the air toward Cuba. Do you think this was the initial part of the plan? Kill JFK and lay the blame on Cuba, USSR? And if so, do you think that was possible? What changed the strategy to blaming only Oswald? Or do you think this was never an Operation Northwoods type of operation and solely a plan for regime change with LBJ to cover it up?
I'll give a preliminary thing here. One thing that was clear from early in the Kennedy administration all the way through is we didn't have the resources to fight multiple wars, which brings up the question, why were they talking about fighting multiple wars? If the answer isn't nuke everything, buddy, and then it's not a problem. So, we haven't nuked anybody. Kennedy stopped a lot of that. So by the time you're moving into 64, you can't go fight in Cuba here and Vietnam there and somewhere else. You got to pick something. And so you could have picked Cuba, but then you wouldn't be Vietnam. We simply didn't have enough power in conventional forces to go fighting all over the place, even to do one correctly. And obviously we didn't have enough power to do it in Vietnam either. So I would just start with that. If anybody else has any other ideas about,
And I'd just like to weigh in by saying this. Remember, both Eisenhower and Kennedy had rejected preventive war, which is a nice namby-pamby word for a cold-blooded first strike destroying half the planet. They had both rejected that. So unless Johnson was willing to approve preventive war, a first strike, then the only thing that those who favored nuclear war would have had to fall back on was preemption. And to my knowledge, the Soviets didn't do anything that would have caused us to get upset after the assassination. Not only did they keep their bombers grounded and not go on alert during the missile crisis because they were so afraid of SAC, but it's my understanding, maybe somebody can provide some support for this, I don't know, but it's my understanding they did not do anything provocative and did not go to any alert after the Kennedy assassination. So therefore, SAC would have had no excuse for a preemptive strike.
and Johnson wasn't going to do anything but Vietnam. And there's a very interesting book by Beschloss, this came out, Presidents at War. And Johnson got so troubled by the fact that they weren't getting anywhere that he actually, Westmoreland asked him for permission to use tactical nuclear weapons. Does everybody know this in this new book by Beschloss? And LBJ turned him down, would not do it.
Yeah, let me weigh in on this notion that why didn't they use the assassination as a way to go ahead and fulfill their dream of attacking Cuba and the Soviet Union. Remember that the plot here is a very sophisticated one, that they've got to get this investigation shut down. That's their goal here. So let's just play this thing out in terms of just analyzing it real carefully. When Johnson goes to, say, Earl Warren and says, I want you to be on the commission, and Warren says, no, I'm Chief Justice of the United States, I got a conflict of interest. Johnson says, look, we're looking at the potential loss of 40, 50 million people here. He's alluding to the prospect of nuclear war. And the idea is that if the American people discover these shooters from the front, they're going to just immediately put pressure on, we got to go to war, we got to retaliate. And the only way you're going to retaliate is with bombing Havana, to smithereens, bombing Moscow. So, which means nuclear war. Well, you see, but behind this scenario, this World War III cover story, is this notion that the American people would have put this pressure on. I think that's just nonsense. Absolutely not. Now, it makes sense in the context of the immediate post-assassination time where people are scared to death and you can scare them. Hey, look, they're going to put me under pressure here. This is how it would have played out if they had gone the other way. Johnson gets on the air and says on television, we've been attacked by the communists. This is a communist conspiracy. We definitely have shots fired from the front. The doctors at the press conference established that, blah, blah, blah. We're going to retaliate here. And then presumably the American people come in with all this pressure. Nonsense. What would have happened as a reality is the Soviet Union and Cuba would immediately have been vociferously denying they did this. And they would have been pointing the finger at the national security establishment of the United States, which in fact the Soviets did in the immediate aftermath of the assassination. Well, and obviously they would be denying it because they had nothing to do with it. At that point, once those denials are made, there's going to be no pressure from the American people for nuclear war. They're going to say, wait a minute, let's back up a minute and let's investigate this. And then they're cooked. Their goose is cooked. As soon as that investigation gets launched, it's going to lead to the national security establishment. So that scenario of going after the Soviet Union and Cuba with a bombing attack could never have been part of the plan, because it never would have succeeded. With fierce denials by the Soviet Union and Cuba, they had done this, because the American people are not dumb. They're not going to go to nuclear war that's going to obviously destroy half the planet, including half the United States, unless they're absolutely sure that this thing went down as they said it did. And so that's why it was never built into the plan.
Let me add to that, Jacob. So, and there was a quid pro quo between the KGB and the CIA. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I'll agree that you never touched Oswald if you agree that we didn't use Oswald. He was radioactive. He was radioactive.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. Let's see. How instrumental was Bill Harvey in the assassination? Harvey was a CIA agent.
John?
Does anybody want to weigh in on that?
Well, you know, so this brings up Helms for me, because Helms is basically in the ascendant and taking over in the CIA. And so when Bobby Kennedy fired Harvey for sending in all those teams that were meant for an invasion, which was the wrong thing to do, they made a mistake again. Instead of banishing him and firing him, they let Helms take care of the situation, and Helms hid him in the basement for a while. And so what happens with Harvey is he gets to go to Rome, which is just about one of the biggest headquarters for Gladio stuff going on in all over Europe. And Harvey actually writes a memo and says that he endorses this strategy of tension. That's a quiet way of saying false flag operations, you know, to discredit socialist and communist parties in Europe. And there's also the Vatican angle too, which is really kind of nasty. But so Harvey is over there and in a situation where there are all these safecrackers and all these assassins and all over the place. But when you go way back in his life and look at what he was before all this happened, he was in the FBI, and then he and Hoover had a falling out. So the CIA took him on, and originally in counterintelligence, I think it was. And so he goes on a long trip all over Europe. And what he does is to meet criminals, Corsicans, all these people that can break into places and open safes and do that. And so he ends up doing that for the CIA, right? And ends up being involved in something called, it originally was Staff D, later on it will be Division D as it expands. And he's in charge of that. And then he makes another long tour all across Europe in the Kennedy years, again contacting these same terrible people, just criminals everywhere. So when you put that background together with what happens to him after the falling out with the Kennedy prison, they send him over to Rome. He's right where he wants to be. And if anybody can stir up trouble, Harvey can do it, and he's got all the contacts and has known them for years, and he's in exactly the right place to do it.
Yeah, I think it's also important to just keep in mind that the exact identity of the players in this is not as important as the fact that this is an institutional regime change operation. Mm-hmm. For example, if we go over to the ouster of Mossadegh and the installation of the Shah, the ouster of Arbenz in Guatemala, the ouster of Allende in Chile, the Congo, Lumumba. I mean, we don't really get preoccupied with who were the exact agents that pulled this off, what are their identities. We look at this as an act of the national security branch of the government. And that's what I think we need to be always remembering here, is that we're looking at a problem, a structural problem within our government. And again, I said this before, and that structural problem is that the US is a national security state.
And we are making other countries national security states too, both in South America, Central America, and all over Europe. And so by extension, that's what they want. They want regime changes there as well. And that was going on in Italy when Kennedy went there in 1963, in the wake of having given his American University speech. Next night going on TV and saying, I've been wrong about the civil rights thing. And then he goes over to Rome to reach out to the left, to do an opening to the left. And they treat him well, they give him a parade and they do all that kind of stuff. But actually what we're doing is pushing Italy to the far right while Kennedy's there. So I would agree with you, but it's not just in our own system. It's that we need to make sure that if we're going to have control for all these multinational corporations and where all the money's coming from, we've got to be able to get their resources at pennies on the dollar and enforce that with armies or gladio armies. We're using real armies in the Americas, as you know.
Oh yeah, oh no, there's no question that every time they do regime building up in these countries they invade, their first goal is to establish a very powerful military intelligence establishment. That's why they love Pinochet so much. He was their model.
But that's the answer to the question on Harvey. That's what he's doing.
Okay.
He's in
all right.
something bad. I'll tell you that.
Doug, did the ARRB figure out what role William Pitzer had in filming or videotaping the autopsy?
No, we didn't address that. We were, as you know, we were prohibited from investigating. We walked a very fine line and a little bit over the line in some cases by trying to clarify the medical evidence, because Congressman Stokes, who had once chaired the HSCA, had requested the board members to do what they could to clarify the medical evidence so they could hang their hat on his request, because he knew the HSCA had not satisfied anybody with their medical report, their medical conclusions. So we did quasi-investigation by trying to clarify questions about the medical evidence, and then just dumping the interviews and depositions in the archives. We weren't allowed to draw official conclusions on what those things meant either. I did that later in a book I wrote, but not official conclusions. So no, we didn't do the kind of investigation where we would try to find out what Pitzer had done or had not done. I don't know if he committed suicide or was murdered. I don't know one way or the other. There are different authors that have taken different positions, but I do believe Dennis David, who told me personally and told me in an interview with the review board that he did see postmortem photographs of President Kennedy in Pitzer's office, shown to him by Pitzer, showing a round entry wound in the throat, not a gash, and showing the top of the head intact, not all opened up, and showing a big hole in the back of the head. So I believe that he saw those photos in Pitzer's office. I don't know who took them, but I know Pitzer showed them to Dennis David, but no, we didn't pursue that. That was outside our charter.
Okay, somebody remembered the name of the book on Dorothy Kilgallen, the reporter who knew too much. That was one of the two. That's why. All right, I've skipped a lot of the questions that I feel like just sort of went astray, and I didn't want to get off into really side areas. So people that didn't get your questions answered, I apologize for that. And we're about approaching the end here. Let me just say, Doug, could you describe how the Northwoods document came to be released and your role in that, if any?
Oh, sure. Be happy to. I was on the military records team and I was hired. And then later the the boss left. He was a retired infantry colonel named Tim Ray. He had just retired from the Army. And he had worked over there in the Pentagon on his last tour. In fact, he had known this guy Goldberg, who actually wrote the Warren Report. and he was buddies with him. And he would make jokes all the time about JFK researchers. So he was an interesting fellow to work around, always making jokes and making light of a lot of things that I took seriously. Eventually, he was let go. And I was kicked upstairs to become his replacement, the head of the military team. So I was the point man dealing with the Department of Defense. And one group I dealt with was the Joint Staff Secretariat. It was the records keepers for the Joint Staff in the Pentagon. And of course, the Joint Staff does all the staff studies for the Joint Chiefs. And they were the most cooperative group that I dealt with. The least cooperative groups were the Air Force and ONI, but the Joint Staff Secretariat was very cooperative. I established a good rapport with them. So they got our long letter, our long shopping list of criteria for searches, and they coughed it up. So they coughed up the full meeting minutes from the SecDef, the 8th SecDef conference in Vietnam from May 63. John Newman, when he wrote his book, he already had a 4-page summary written by an admiral, which turns out it was very accurate. But they coughed up the whole set of minute meetings for that, over 200 pages. And then they coughed up Northwoods. And it was really a surprise that the government would actually follow the JFK Records Act and give us something that we had declared relevant, which was anything to do with Cuba or Vietnam. And they gave it to us in spite of embarrassment. They weren't, people in the government were not allowed by the JFK Records Act to redact things or withhold things because of embarrassment to agencies or individuals. So these guys complied with the law. They provided it to us. And then we instituted something called the Joint Declassification Session, where we forced, instead of doing round robin, one agency by one agency by one agency, all taking their time reviewing the records and then taking 2 or 3 years to get declassified, we forced people to come to our office once a week and review the Northwoods file and later the Califano papers about the new Cuban policy in '63, review those things at the same table. And it really accelerated their release. I think we were able to release those in '97 and significant portions of them in '97. And so I just want to give all credit to the Joint Staff Secretariat for being cooperative, and to Jeremy Gunn, who, after 1 year of doing nothing, the Pentagon was castigated. Jeremy Gunn went over there with several of us in tow, and we met with a bunch of people in the Office of General Counsel for the Department of Defense. I think they had 19 people there. We had 4, we were outnumbered. And he basically said, you guys haven't done anything for a year. You haven't complied, and you need to comply, because we're going to be writing a report which talks about who complied and who cooperated and who didn't. And you have an obligation under the law. And so they really got on the stick, at least the Joint Staff Secretariat did. Not so much ONI, but the Army was very cooperative. Army, I'll finish up my answer here. The Army, forget the exact name, Investigative Records Repository at Fort Meade, IRR, coughed up a lot of records, including all the Viciano records showing that he was really working for the Army. I was able to identify those as assassination records. I didn't quite understand the import of them, but I identified them as assassination records. And then later, Dan Hardway and John Newman figure out how important they were. Oh, Viciano's really working for the Army then, not for the CIA. So they were very cooperative, the IRR and the Joint Staff Secretariat. So we just, I was lucky enough to be the tip of the spear of a bigger effort, the JFK Act, Jeremy Gunn getting them off of top dead center, and civilian staffers in the Joint Staff Secretariat who took the law seriously. So I was very happy with them.
Okay. I think we're going to wrap things up unless somebody has any concluding remark here. Okay, we got a comment from one of our viewers. Great series, bravo you all. And it was a great series. I mean, I know I'm biased and we put this thing on, but I got to tell you guys, this is one of the best conferences the Future Freedom Foundation has ever put on. We're just really, really pleased with how it went. I want to thank you all for your participation. I want to thank all the speakers. I know there's some speakers here that are not part of the panel. We lost Mike Swanson. I got a text from him saying that his computer locked up and he's having to reboot. But I want to thank you for participating in this. I want to thank all our viewers. Keep in mind that all of these sessions are going to be online. Most of them are already on there all the way up through last week at fff.org. This one will be going up in the next few days. And so like I said in my concluding remark, you know, that our job is to seek the truth and is to speak the truth. And that's what we're doing in this. We're not looking for theories, as the CIA often goes out telling people, you know, conspiracy theory and stuff. We're looking at where the evidence leads. And this evidence, in my opinion, is overwhelming, much more beyond the test used in a criminal case, beyond a reasonable doubt. This is beyond a doubt the evidence establishing certainly a fraudulent autopsy. And then once you reach that conclusion, there's no other conclusion that can be reached than that it was part of the cover-up of the National Security State's regime change operation. So thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you all at the next one.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
It was fun, interesting too. Learned a lot myself.
Great. Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks all of you. And that'll adjourn our meeting.